equivalent units, we identify the product cost, compute the cost per equivalent unit, and then assign the cost to ending work in process and what was transferred out. The physical can't change. The fact that, going back to the problem we were working with the beer, the beginning balance for our brewing was 20,000 units. Units started with 92,000, transferred out with 96,000, and the ending balance was 16,000. That can't change. We can't change the physical. Accountants can't go in and actually, change the amount of beer that was processed. Can't do anything about that. So we have on this side step one is the same. Nothing different here. Just remembering this equation, we can figure out the units. And since we're dealing with the first process, and that's all we'll deal with in FIFO, the total costs are the same. We still have beginning balance cost, the direct materials, 1,624. 19,132 for conversion. And then the cost added during June. Total costs don't change. We still spent the same amount of money. We can't do anything about changing that just because of the way we're going to calculate the cost that's transferred out. The difference comes in how we calculate equivalent units. Because what's going to happen? According to FIFO, the first units to be completed are those. Those are the first units that are going to be transferred out. So of this 96,000, 20,000 come from beginning WIP, 76,000 were started and completed in June. Okay. So first of all, does that make sense? That discuss FIFO. First in, first out. The first one's available, the first one's to be completed. So that means that technically these costs will be the first cost to be transferred out, those beginning balances. But the issue comes in is these 20,000 units on June 1st. Well, since they're still in work in process in brewing, that means they weren't done. So that means in June we still had to add some more costs. So this cost here isn't enough to give us 20,000 completed units. We still have some costs to add in June. Now granted, those are the first costs that we add in June, and those are going to be the first costs to be transferred out. But we have to figure out how much we had to put into these 20,000 units during the month of June. Because we already know that these costs are going to be transferred out. So we're going to keep those separate. So we need to figure out how much was related to finishing beginning work in process, how much was for starting and completing units, and how much was for ending work in process. So that's what we got to figure out now, because this, how much was related to beginning WIP And that the started and completed will go to transferred out, and this, of course, stays in ending work in process. Yes?
Since the ending balance is less than beginning, then there won't be any beginning with when the unit started, like in that number? Because how much was related to unit beginning work in process?
So I'm trying to think here what you're... Well, what's going to happen? So you're saying since ending with is less than beginning with, what that means is that of this 92,000, so we have completed all this. This just means less for left. All of these are going to be transferred out, and that means we have 76,000 of these that are completed 100% within June. 16,000 of these aren't finished yet. Okay. So in FIFO, we're going to keep up with this separately from this. So we got to figure out equivalent units a little bit differently. We have to figure out how far along this beginning balance was. Well, if we go back, we find out that it was 75% complete in terms of direct materials. I think that's right. Yeah. And 50% complete in terms of conversion. And remember, this was 80% direct materials, 60% conversion. So that means last month, so we're talking about June here, so May, 75% of the direct materials were added and 50% of the conversion costs were added in May. So that means in June, we had to add 25% more of the direct materials and 50% more of the conversion. So how do we calculate equivalent units? Because now we're trying to figure out how much did this cost buy us. We know how much this cost bought us. It bought us 20,000 partially completed units. We figured that out last month. Now we're trying to figure out how much that cost bought us. So, equivalent unit calculation. So what was transferred out? Well, physical units, we see were 96,000. Well, where did they come from? The first 96,000 come from beginning with. So that's 20,000 units. Next come from units started and completed in June. That's the 76,000. Okay. So equivalent units. So for direct materials, these direct materials that are these units that were from beginning with, these 20,000 units. In June, we had to add 25% more direct materials. So cost related to finishing these up is only related to 25% of the total direct materials needed. So the hops, basically, is what we're talking about. So in terms of equivalent units for the month of June, so FIFO is just going to snap it off and see, at this point, calculating equivalent units, what happened in June. In June, we added 25% of the direct materials. Because they were 75% complete already, to make them equal 100, we know they're transferred out, we had to add 25% more. In terms of conversion, don't get confused because 50% is that odd number. It's still that we added 50% last month, so to finishing them up, we need to add 50% more conversion costs. Basically, these were halfway through the process. when May ended. So we have to add 50% here. So equivalent units, these 20,000, and we have to finish up first. Equivalent units then in June were 5,000 and 10,000 for conversion. Next, these 76,000 units that were completely within the boundaries of June. There's no work before, there's no work after. So 100% of the effort went into these 76,000 within the bounds of June. So those equivalent units, 100% completed within June. And then what else happened in June? Well, we still have a few units that we started. Well, this part's no different from weighted average, how we handle them. Ending with physical units for 16,000. In terms of direct material, we added 80% of the direct material within June. 12,800. And we added 60% of the conversion within June. So total equivalent units. 5,000 plus 76,000 plus 12,800 . $93,800. During the month of June, we added enough direct materials that we could have created 93,800 completed units. That's how much direct material we poured in there. Conversion cost, the 10,000 plus the 76,000 plus the 9,600. 95,600. During the month of June, we added enough cost for conversion to have created 95,600 completed units. Okay. So FIFO, we're just calculating equivalent units for June. Ignoring what already went into those 20,000 units. Because we already know that that's being transferred out. So then when we calculate the cost per equivalent unit, we're just going to look at June cost, because this is just the equivalent units for June. This is just the production side of June. So we want just the cost side of June. So all we're concerned with is these costs. So June cost, $86,296 for direct materials. $213,188 for conversion. So what does it say? Within the month of June, we spent $86,296 worth of direct materials. Typically spending that much would have meant we could have gotten 93,800 completed units. So cost, so 86,296 divided by the 93,800 equivalent units. 92 cents per equivalent unit. The 213,188 divided by the 95,600. In terms of conversion, we get $2.23 per equivalent unit. Okay. So the difficulty here, we add how we figure out these 96,000 that were transferred out. We have to split them up because we're just looking at June here. Because we already know these costs are going to be transferred out first. That's what FIFO means, first in, first out. So now how do we figure out how much this 96,000 units cost us? Well, we have multiple steps now. It's not as simple as taking the 96,000 and multiplying it by these numbers. So where it comes back to how much was related to the finishing beginning with, how much was related to the started and completed units. So transfer it out. We know, first of all, that transferred out, first we have these 20,000 units here. These are going to be the first to transfer out. So how much cost is related to these? Well, for direct materials, we start with 11,624, and for conversion, 19,132. Those were prior period costs related to these 20,000. To complete them then, well, now we got to get the equivalent units. Direct material, it was 5,000. Times the cost per equivalent unit. $10,000 conversion equivalent units. So, cost from beginning with plus the cost to finish those units in beginning with then those units that were completely started and finished within the month of June. Those 76,000 units started and completed in June. And we know that those were 76,000, so 76,000 times 0.92. $76,000 times 2.23. So the beginning balance transfers first. Then we figure out how much of this total cost was related to finishing that beginning balance. And then how much of this total cost was related to units 100% started and completed within the month of June. total cost transferred out. $297,056. Cost related to beginning WEP, cost related to finishing beginning WEP, and then the cost related to those units 100% worked on within June. These are the first to transfer out, then came these units. So then the units that are left were the last units to be started. Now that's calculated just as we've done before. Either you can take your total, subtract off $239,400, or in WIP, it's the same. Equivalent units. It's different cost per equivalent unit and weighted average. And then 297,056 plus 33,184 gets us back to the total cost of 330,240 that we've been dealing with all along. Transfer it out. Ending with.
Now the difference between that and what we did with the weighted average, to me, is not very much. And that is
Precisely.
a lot more work.
Yeah.
So, okay. It's only a difference of like, what, $544?
Right. Let's not focus on weighted average first.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
That 80% and 60%, how's that? Is that just given to us? Is that?
Yeah, that was from last week when I handed you that sheet that had all that given to you. Yeah.
Okay.
It says 75 at the beginning, and 5 more after the process has been 60%, and then the final 20 when the process.
Yeah, that was so I could get to this statement. If you go to that other page that I printed off from the PowerPoint,
one?
yeah,
Okay.
that tells you exactly
Okay.
it's 80.
Because I was like, how do we know it's 80 and not 90, and that we didn't need to add the other 20% in, but okay.
So yeah, in some format, these were given to you.
Okay.
So yeah, so that was the last objective, was to compare FIFO and weighted average. The thing is, yes, when it came down, at least in this example, not much difference in the cost. And really in the long run, what's going to happen? All the costs are going to end up eventually in cost of goods sold because you're eventually going to sell it. It's just when do they hit? Both methods perfectly acceptable for accounting purposes. You get to choose. The difference is that FIFO is technically more realistic. It's really following along how you think inventory would go. You would expect, especially in my beer example, that you're going to complete the beer that's sitting in the brewery first. So all FIFO does is try to add that element of a little bit more realism. Trade-off is a little bit more complicated. Yes, it makes it a little bit more easier if you set up Excel to do it for you and that sort of thing. But that is, it is a little bit more complicated, so you've got to balance realism with complexity. As far as the exam goes, there'll be a problem from both. So if you don't like FIFO, don't choose that one. Choose one of the other 4 problems. And there will be one multiple choice question. One. So at least then you have a 1-4 chance of guessing if you can't get FIFO down. But yes, FIFO is a little bit more complicated, but for some people, you're counting, you have to get a math background, it's not really that big of a deal. And it might be a little bit easier than before you get into variances, so you might want to choose that problem. But the difference is, where you're going to trip up is right here. It's because you're given 75 and 50, and you immediately just want to use those numbers. But no, that's what was added last month. And we got to focus on what was added this month. So that's where we have to change it to what was added this month based on what we need to add to complete them. So that's the tricky part, is remembering that. And then remembering you're only using June cost here because you're just looking at the equivalent units for June. You don't want to add these beginning costs because you already know that those are going to be transferred out. You don't have to do anything with them. We know that these first 20,000 units, which these costs are related to, are going to be the first ones transferred out. Okay? Questions on this?